to NonTheology. This is, once again, a weekly or bi-weekly, or whenever we want to do it, podcast about theology, non-theology, and everything in between. You can visit us online at nontheology.com, and though we aren't likable in real life, we are likable on Facebook at facebook.com/nontheology. I am the host, Gabe, and I'm joined by a ghost. Eric, where the hell have you been?
I'm back. I'm so back. Okay, well, a couple of things. I'm sorry for a couple of reasons. Mostly I'm sorry because I know the show goes off a lot better when I'm not on it. So sorry that I'm back to just be the B- student or whatever I am is back for a few episodes, I'm sure. At least a few. Hopefully many. So how many episodes have gone up since I was on one?
I think just 2.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure if there's anybody who's actually a regular listener, which I still can't figure out why that would be, but if you're actually a regular listener, I'm sure you thought, well, that clown Eric's finally been kicked off the show. Gabe finally was like, well, I've had enough of that guy. Just gonna go on without him. But no, here I am. So I'm glad to be back.
Well, so let me give our listeners a little bit of background story here. Months and months went by of me proposing Eric, hey, do you want to do a show this weekend? Hey, Christopher Hitchens' birthday is coming up. Do you want to do a commemoration episode? Facebook, text message, email, no response, ever. And all of a sudden, I get like 5 long apologetic emails saying, oh, I'm really sorry that I didn't get back to you. I know we're pod partners.
If it wasn't for the fact that we're friends outside of the show, I wouldn't have felt bad about it.
I do not consider you a friend outside of the show.
I work like a maniac during the summertime. I have 4 jobs, but it's basically like when I get a day off, I go to work is what I do. So,
and I can't blame it entirely on Eric. I have a new job as well, and the problem is Eric basically works in the entertainment industry. Which is where people go when they're not working. And I have a normal 9 to 5 kind of job. So our schedules basically have 0 overlap.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I have to go to work every weekday morning. And then in the afternoons, I have to go to my other jobs. And then I also work at the water park that I have spoken about ad nauseum in the past. I have to do that on the weekends. So it's like I have my week schedule and then I have my, loud water park people screaming at me for this and that, whatever job on the weekends. So it's been pretty busy, but we digress.
Yeah, well, I was hoping...
I'm not kicked off the podcast, in case anybody was... I'm sure that if you're a regular listener, that's what you thought had happened.
You're not kicked off, but you're awfully close. Well, I was hoping that we would go this entire time without anyone noticing that we hadn't produced any new episodes, but we got a comment on the website last night. This is from Liam.
No, Kevin. It's from Kevin.
No, this one's from Liam.
Fine.
Are you guys dead, or is it just the podcast?
So, not a question of whether or not the podcast was dead. Certainly the podcast is dead. That much I'm sure of. But maybe you guys are dead too.
Maybe if I'm lucky.
Yeah. I would just be more comfortable knowing that those 2 buffoons were no longer on the planet.
No longer had any possibility of producing any more 1s and 0s to put on the internet.
Breathing up all the good air.
All right, so Eric, what is this episode going to be about?
This is the interview with Mr. John Loftus.
Ooh.
And it is a terrific interview. I loved it. It's so fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot.
I am sure that you will too. You'll enjoy hearing what he has to say a lot more than you'll enjoy hearing what I have to say.
Yeah, so John Loftus has written previously about what he calls the outsider test for faith. Won't explain that right now, because that's kind of Loftus's job.
Yeah.
So, Eric, you want to just go ahead and let this episode play?
Let's do it.
All right.
Enjoy.
We are honored today to be joined by former evangelical preacher turned atheist author and activist John Loftus. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, it's great. You've been a pretty prolific author about atheism, but it's also really cool to get to speak to someone who's been so deep in both the atheist and theist community.
Well, I'm truly humbled that, people appreciate my work. It's very gratifying. I am relentless. I have a lot of passion for what I do. And it's mainly because I, quote unquote, wasted 40 years of my life on that delusion. And since I did, I just want to pay back what it deserves, a sound of trashing.
I like this guy, John Loftus. He sounds like a guy I can get along with.
Yep.
I agree.
More people more passionate than I am, and I know there are out there, but yeah, I'm pretty relentless.
So, I'm actually kind of wondering, you spent such a long time in the theist community and even within theist academic circles. What was it like for you transitioning from being a rather in-depth, getting 2 master's degrees in theistic type studies? How has it been for you sort of transitioning? Has it been a weird worldview changing catastrophic event, or has it been something more slow and easy to digest?
Well, first, I have 3 master's degrees, and they're in the philosophy of religion, and I did a year and a half of PhD work at Marquette University. I have more education than most PhDs do. But that doesn't, I still don't have that sheepskin.
Right.
But I've had I guess over 25 years of thinking about these issues, so that should count for something. Whatever. But how is it like for me transitioning? Well, Dan Barker talks about that in his book God or Godless, and I concur. It's like pulling your hair out. It's quite wrenching existentially to know that your whole life your eyes were just clouded and blinded, and you have to reorient your life. You have to learn to make your own decisions apart from some holy textbook. You have to make new friends because the old friends, many of them, think, you're the devil, especially if you have a blog called Debunking Christianity.
Yeah.
I've lost some friends over that, and others, they would send me emails with Bible verses that I could read in the Hebrew and the Greek, as if, I'm sorry, I hadn't considered that before.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Loftus, I don't know if, your 3 master's degrees in divinity had made you come across this Bible verse.
Oh, yeah, I usually respond to someone who emails me, a Christian, sometimes a friend, and I say, there's really nothing important that you can tell me that I haven't considered before. But they proceed to tell me anyway.
Right, yeah.
I have more, I tell them I have more to teach you than you could ever teach me. And, maybe that's a bit arrogant, but I really think so, especially a lot of these emails that I get from, Christians who, never really studied it in depth, but read the Bible a few times and gone to church most of their lives. And they're not interested in what I have to say usually. They've got to spit out what they want to say and, ignore my, responses. But that's the way it is. That's the nature of the delusion, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, it does sound arrogant when you say it, but I think that there's a certain amount of earned arrogance that someone with 3 master's degrees and a lot of time and a lot of well-received books can sort of throw around if they feel so inclined.
Yeah, I'm not really fat or anything, but I like to try to throw my fatness around. My weight,
Right.
Especially if I don't want to really spend a lot of time one-on-one, and I don't usually do that. I usually say to people, first, you need to be caught up to speed. I don't really want to have a conversation with you until you read my books. Then we might, have some kind of, way to proceed. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, but most of them don't. They have their Bible verses to spit out, and, they're not really interested in truly evaluating their faith.
I'm sure they're probably under the impression that their book is way more important than your book, so they don't need to read yours. They have their own.
Well, we're so far apart. We live in different intellectual universes, and
right.
In order for them to consider an atheist viewpoint, they first have to become moderates, and then they have to become liberals, and then they have to become, say, deists or agnostics. It's a trajectory that we're just so far apart, and they have this religious feeling inside their hearts that it's an anathema to even probably talk to me. Some people won't even buy my books because they don't want to contribute to the cause, even though I make about 50 cents per sale. I've even told them, I say, well, I'll give you 50 cents. But then I said, well, but since postage costs this, then you get about that, and the check and my time writing, and the check for about 8 cents, 7 cents isn't worth it.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, Gabe and I have a similar approach, actually, when it comes to buying, like, Christian materials. I know Gabe's bought a few books just sort of written by apologists that we do or don't like, but buys them at half-price books just to make sure that they don't get any of the they don't get any of the benefit from it, or that none of the money goes to support their cause, you know?
Yeah, I understand that coming from both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got an awesome tiny little library of
Yeah.
apologetics and history of this and that religion from all sorts of different things. Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of my library, actually.
Yeah, you need to understand the objections of your opponents, and so yeah, I encourage people to buy, all kinds of books. Now, my specialty, of course, isn't Scientology, so I don't have any of their books, or Mormonism, or Jehovah's Witnesses. I have a few books on what Christians call the cults, and it's quite interesting to read those books because I find that when Christians label a different religion as a cult, they fail to understand that the origination of their religion was a cult, was considered a cult by others. I mean, they all start out as cults, however you want to define the word cults. So, but I find that they debunk these other cults by the same reasons I debunk theirs. I mean, basically, they would say lack of sufficient evidence.
Yeah.
Sometimes they say, well, because my faith is true, yours is false. Well, that's special pleading. That's
Yeah.
that doesn't work. First, you have to establish that your faith is correct, before you can use that argument. And if you're debunking other religions because of the lack of sufficient evidence, then let's look at yours based on whether it has sufficient evidence.
Yeah, that's a point that you've actually made a couple of times previously, that people will try and discard whatever evidence of other religions they think they have, just by cavalierly assuming that their religion that they've been raised with is the correct one, and that, this religion can't be true because mine is true. And that's just that's their starting point.
Yes, it's circular reasoning. I mean, mine's true, yours is false, and therefore mine's true. It's special pleading, basically. We're pleading on behalf of that which we were raised to believe, and because we were raised to believe it, we can't see anything different, and so therefore, these other religions are false. And yet these other people in these other religions will do the same thing, special pleading. Yeah.
Well, this is definitely leading us into sort of what we wanted to talk about today, and that's what you've written about many times, is the outsider test for faith. I'd love to have you explain what the outsider test for faith is, but hopefully we can start with some definitions. So, can you tell us what you mean by faith, and also who is an outsider?
Sure. I have come to the conclusion that faith is a vice, not a virtue. Skepticism is the antithesis of faith. And now, it's not something I always accepted, but when I see how people of different religious faiths argue, based on special pleading and not on sufficient evidence, I just have to conclude that faith is a cognitive bias. It ought to be listed among the, Wikipedia site listings of cognitive biases. And it's basically overestimating any confirming evidence and underestimating any disconfirming evidence. And as such, it's an irrational leap over the probabilities. And, I eschew faith. I think faith is misguided, dangerous, irrelevant, and just wrong.
Right. Yeah, and it's one of those things that people can be so firmly convinced that their faith is true, but every single other person in the world will have a completely diametrically opposed faith and hold it just as strongly.
Yeah, they need to understand that. They need to take seriously the demographics that, religions are accepted and believed and defended and propagated within separate geographical locations around the globe. I mean, you don't find scientists in one part of the globe accepting plate tectonics and the others not. You don't find scientists in one part of the globe saying that the sun revolves around the earth and others saying, no, that's wrong. The earth revolves around the sun, which we know is true. Is the case. I mean, science gets results. Science convinces. Faith doesn't. It's based on, where and when you were born. And this goes back all, through history. So faith is a cognitive bias, by sure.
All right. So this is a test for evaluating faiths. Now, it's the outsider test for faith. So what's an outsider? What do you mean by that?
Well, an outsider is something we all are. We're non-believers in some religions.
Right. So, I mean, we're all a non-believer or an outsider to something, be it Scientology or Mormonism or Christianity.
Yeah, and so we already know what it's like to be an outsider. If you were born in a different part of the globe, you would be an outsider to Christianity. And if you were born in, inside Christianity, you'd be an outsider to any of these other world religions. So we know what it's like to be an outsider. We are all outsiders to some degree. We're non-believers. Now, if there's a God that wants us to believe in the correct faith, then people who were born as outsiders, into a different religious culture, should be able to be convinced by the evidence, should be able to be convinced by the arguments. Because if not, then everyone who is born outside of, say, Christianity will be condemned to hell merely by the fact of where they were born.
Right.
So an outsider is a non-believer, basically. That eliminates all these false scenarios about things that I've heard Christians say. Well, what about an outsider to love? Or what about a Martian? Although a Martian is not too bad of an analogy, I guess. Or what about an outsider to science itself? Now, that's the most bizarre kind of objection to the outsider test for faith, because they fail to understand what an outsider is. An outsider is merely a non-believer. An outsider is not some Spock who there are no Spockian typed individuals. An outsider isn't someone who's an outsider to love. And they use all these kinds of bizarre types of scenarios. No, we're just talking about a reasonable non-belief. And I define what a reasonable non-belief is in the book. And that is someone who accepts the results of science. And I point out, the demographics of where we were born. You have to accept that. That's being an informed outsider. And someone who understands the science of brain biology, that is, you accept the fact that, we were raised, our brains are such that they are belief engines. And as belief engines, we see agents behind, the rustling leaves or a sound in the night. We think there must be someone there. Since we do that, we have to ask ourselves and question whether or not, based on this brain biology, that we are doing the same thing when there's a thunderstorm or a lightning strike. And that's what the ancients declared. They said, well, there must be, a god or gods up there who did this. And so given brain biology, given the demographics, and given the nature of a psychology that says we are really inept at, rationally evaluating some arguments. That's because of our brains. And so because of the fact that we are inept at being reasonable with evidence in general, we ought to demand sufficient evidence, because anything, even ridiculous ideas, can be defended with reasoning if you accept a false premise or a false assumption. So things like that. And it seems like to me that, an outsider, a non-believer, should demand sufficient evidence for their own faith because of these factors and others that I mentioned in the book. And without that sufficient evidence, they should reject their faith.
Well, that sounds really good. So we should evaluate how sensitive to truth and reality a belief system is without assuming the truth of its core, assumptions or its axioms. Is that sort of what it means to you to be an outsider? That's the impression that I've gotten from the book. But you're taking more of a scientific bent to this. Is that
right? Now, if someone objects to evaluating their own faith as an outsider or a non-believer, then I merely ask them why the double standard. One of the key qualities of a truth system is one that doesn't have double standards. It's one of the key things.
Right.
So they have to justify why they take the double standard. One for their own faith, using special pleading type of arguments, and one for the other faiths they reject. And so far, I haven't found anyone who can avoid that dilemma, except for taking the outsider test for faith itself.
Right, and in terms of evaluating things without assuming sort of the core assumptions or premises that are already entailed within, in this case, a belief system or a religion, that's exactly what we do all the time in science. That's, for example, how the theory of general relativity was first put to the test. They had known for a long time that the planet Mercury was moving a lot faster than anyone would have predicted under Newtonian mechanics, but the theory of general relativity very accurately predicted its speed, and we were able to just test that right then and there without the need to assume that general relativity is true, or assume that without believing in general relativity we have no basis for logic or rationality or morals or something like that. That's what we do. It's almost a blasé concept in science. We evaluate things without just assuming they're true in the first place.
Yeah, science works, faith doesn't. What's fun to me is to watch believers argue with themselves. Within the same tradition.
I completely agree. That is one of my favorite pastimes. I was in a Christian apologetics club when I was in college, And that was just my favorite thing to do, is to watch the budding apologists argue over these things of what does it mean for God to be omniscient, and I loved it.
What I like to do is read these books that Zondervan and University Press and Baker Books are putting out called 4 Views of This, 5 Views of That, 6 Views of That. I have developed quite a collection of those, and some of them I've discarded as irrelevant anymore. But I mean, I swear they make objections to each other's arguments that sound cogent. And it's interesting to me that after finishing reading one of those books, you just kind of throw up your hands and say, well, none of them are right.
Right. Every single one of these objections to the other faiths seems to be very compelling.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's interesting. You point that out, that's actually an application of the outsider test for faith. It's just not being applied to one's own religion.
Yeah, they have a need to believe. I think that you can sum up the defenses that we read of their faith in that. They have a need to believe. It's a social need. It's an existential need. They have to have a need for, an afterlife, because if I ever want to see Auntie Anne again, then I'll have to see her in the afterlife, and I sure don't want to miss out. So it comes down to a need to believe. I don't think people are all that rational when they evaluate evidence of a mundane sort, so how much more so will they not be rational when it comes to nebulous things that have no evidence for them at all? You just have to keep pointing them toward the evidence and pointing them toward the fact that, we don't think rationally. Once you recognize that as human beings we don't think all that rationally, and the key thing here is just look at people who are in love, and you don't see the faults in the person you love, and that's because we ignore evidence that's to the contrary. And then also look at people who are emotionally engaged, that is, people who are angry, and they don't think I've seen some really highly intelligent people. When they're emotionally engaged, it's amazing to see how stupid they are.
Yeah, oh my gosh, absolutely.
So with those caveats, you just have to force upon the believer to accept nothing less than sufficient evidence for their own faith. And I think the outsider test for faith helps them see that. Now, whether they accept it or not, if you read the book, you'll see obviously they don't.
Right. Now, what we're talking about, how these different people will provide very cogent and very compelling critiques of other people's belief systems, but not their own. I mean, this is somewhat related to the problem of religious pluralism, which is one of many problems that you propose the outsider test for faith can solve. So what is religious pluralism, and what problems does it pose for Christianity?
Well, the problem is that people, have a different view of things, because faith has no method. How can we solve the problem of so many people believing contrary things? No method has solved them yet. Like I said, I'm going to focus on special pleading. I've talked to some guys stressing the fact that Christianity is wrong. And I remember his name was Todd. He says, John, you got to have faith. Well, I said to him, well, listen, what if I were talking to a Muslim and he said the same thing? John, you just got to have faith. Well, see, that answer rings hollow. Right. So we have to have a method. We have to have a sound method for solving the problem of religious diversity, religious pluralism that we see around the globe. Since nothing has worked before. I mean, just think of the militant Muslims who flew planes into, those buildings on 9/11. Well, ask them if they've, evaluated their faith, ask them if they were certain of their faith, and to a man, they would say yes.
Oh, yeah, you're going to get a sincere and enthusiastic, yes, my faith is true.
Right. Christians just don't understand that. They just don't understand. No, they were wrong. They were deluded. They were, deceived by Satan. They were ignorant. I mean, all these excuses, except for the Satan thing, is true of them. But I think that it's true of the Christians as well. I mean, anyway, in order to show this, you just have to ask them why the double standard. First off, they have to understand the problem. Right. And then when you understand the problem, you have to offer a method for determining which religion is true if there is one. And in my book, I don't just say, here's a good method. I've decided to say, here is the only method. Science basically is the method. It's just that in order to get them to understand that science is the method, all you have to do is point out that when they dispute other religions, they use science and reasoning to do so. So if you can get them to see that they're operating on a double standard and that no method has worked before, then perhaps we have a chance with some of them.
Right. Now, within that sort of discussion of religious pluralism, there's a couple of different problems that always come up. One that bothers me the most, and I don't understand at all why Christians don't find this more troubling than they do, but it's the fact that, as you mentioned earlier in the show, religious belief is not just sort of universally distributed across the globe. You've got huge pockets of Christianity here and Islam over here and Hinduism over here. As you've said many times in your books and in debates and blogs, if you were born, say you're talking to a Christian, if you were born somewhere else in a predominantly Hindu society, you would almost certainly be a Hindu. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, you'd almost certainly be a Muslim. Well, in Saudi Arabia is a different case because it's legislated, but and it's a tough thing to actually tease out what's going on here because regarding what it is that determines people's beliefs as adults, there's some mixed messages that come out of psychological literature, at least. There's people who say that the biggest factor is what your parents believed, and other people find a stronger effect from what your peers believe, and then there's, of course, these weird interactions because your parents are the ones who largely decide what peers you happen to have access to. I mean, it's not actually, to me, all that clear what the determining factor is, but the take-home message, the punchline here, is that these are all environmental factors. It's not that people are sitting down and giving a slow and rational consideration of the data they have access to. This is a series of bandwagon effects over the years and over the centuries. This is what happens.
Right, and once we understand that we're not really all that rational, we've got to recognize and deal seriously with the facts that you've just mentioned. I mean, we just don't do that. Yeah, all those things are factored into what we believe, and they're largely environmental. I don't know how much we believe that isn't due to our environment. I mean, I could make that argument. I mean, I think faith or belief is involuntary. And, but I didn't go into much detail into the book itself because I am trying to reach Christians. But if I can just say that it's overwhelmingly determinative of what we believe, then maybe they might at least be willing to follow that argument and say to themselves, well, you know what? How do I know my faith is the correct one when what I believe is overwhelmingly determined based on, these factors?
Yeah, I think that's largely true and largely unfortunate that a lot of what we believe is not believed on particularly good evidence, if it's ever believed on evidence in the first place.
Now, Christians will turn that around on me and they'll say, well, how do you know that what you think is it has any better grounds for it if it's based on these environmental pressures? Well, I think that science solves those kinds of things, and I deal with science a lot in the book because science convinces. Now, let's say that there is a test that proves we don't have any free will. Well, could you hear a believer saying, well, how can you believe that test since this is all of what you've been exposed to? And I make the argument that, well, that's because the test provides sufficient evidence for it. So if there's sufficient evidence for the fact that we have no free will, then that's what you should accept. They say, well, isn't that self-defeating? Well, science is the only game in town, you see. It's a lot better than just wishful thinking.
Right. So I guess the next thing to ask about, now that we've explained what the test is, I'm wondering, how does someone do it? That actually seems to me like the hardest thing to really wrap my mind around. How can someone actually evaluate a belief system or faith from the perspective of an outsider? I mean, do you think that people can actually discard these assumptions they have?
Well, not easily, that's for sure. I think Valerie Tirico had a blurb on the book that said that she finds it credible to think that believers just can't do it, but yet it doesn't say anything against the fact that the outsider test for faith is the golden standard. I mean, we just have to hold up the golden standard and, hope that there are some people who will understand it and apply it and see what they get from applying it. And that's just the best we can do. I've never said I could convince believers otherwise. Yeah. I think the delusion is that strong.
I mean, would you say that it's fair to suggest that definitely certain people won't actually be able to perform the outsider test for faith? Because when I'm thinking about the people in my life who are very, very religious, I'm certain of the fact that they won't be able to do this because, in the back of their mind, they're going to think, well, I've had these experiences and I have, felt these things and I've seen these things and I know that there's no possible explanation for the way I felt or what I saw other than, the God that I already happen to believe in kind of thing, Yeah,
I agree. I think some people are incapable of it. So this is not something I'm claiming will convince believers. I don't know what will convince them, but I do think that it's got a good chance. How's that?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the delusion is just simply just that strong that they won't even, entertain the idea. You should see some of the online reviews of the book by Christians. I mean, they're responding to the book. No, really, they're responding to the book as if I never wrote it.
Right, I can see that. I can see
don't know
that.
what book they're actually reviewing. I've dealt with all of the objections fairly and honestly, and I think firmly, and yet they respond to the book with those same objections.
Right.
as if I never dealt with them.
Right,
They didn't see it.
Yeah.
It's strange to me, and I have no comment on that. I think anyone who's willing to read my book and their review will see, I mean, they should see anyway, that I've already responded to this review.
I guess I sort of have another question sort of in this same vein of people being able to actually honestly perform the outsider test for faith, or maybe people not being able to. And there's a quote from Shermer that I think is really well placed in the chapter about the outsider test for faith, and it basically just kind of goes on to say that people rarely weigh evidence pro and con and actually decide what the good evidence is and what the bad evidence is. They usually just take the evidence they like and run with it and just discard the evidence that they don't like, regardless of whether or not it's good. And at the end of the quote, it says, we all do this, of course, but smart people are better at it. And
Right.
about halfway through the chapter, I'm reading it, and I don't read very often, by the way, and your book was real good. So the fact that I actually sat down and read it is really sort of a compliment in and of itself. But anyways,
You should consider that to be one of the highest compliments you could ever get from Eric, actually.
But anyways, so I'm reading the chapter, and about halfway through, I'm kind of thinking, well, it kind of seems like the smarter you are, the better chance you'll have of being able to sort of shed your religious presuppositions and actually honestly assess what's going on. So is this a case of, smart or intelligent people versus non-intelligent people, or am I being unfair and just stroking my own ego with that?
I wonder about that. I think that the more educated you are in a delusion, then the more unlikely you are to see it as a delusion. I think that in many cases, there's always an exception or two. I mean, a lot of exceptions, but not that many. We can mention Bart Ehrman. He was educated and left the faith. Robert Price. We can talk about Dr. Avalos and myself. So the more educated you become in the faith, then there are people who, when they do that, they say, this is bunk, right? There are a lot of it like that. But there are many that where they have a great deal of education, in their faith. I think perhaps they have more invested.
Mm-hmm.
If they're they have the prestige of having written some pretty good things. I think they can actually be more deluded.
Yeah, that's
Right.
the other thing that I think I've heard Shermer say is that the more educated you are, the more able you'll be to find clever ways of justifying obviously untrue things.
Yeah, just consider debating one of the Mormon scholars. I actually met a Mormon scholar at the Society of Biblical Literature. I thought that was an oxymoron.
Right.
I consider them to be pseudo-intellectuals. That's because they don't take on the strongest arguments, and deal with them. They ignore them. And I've been doing some reviews of Christian books online recently where I am making that case.
I completely agree with you that a lot of the Mormon intellectuals are pseudo-intellectuals. I mean, there's a Mormon Faircast. It's a Mormon apologetics podcast that I listen to periodically. And it's comical to listen to them defend these things in what are, no one would accept this if it were another religion.
Exactly. And consider Scientologists. I mean, consider the people who are in power within the Scientology faith. I mean, do you think for one moment they would say, you know what, you got a good point there, buddy?
Yeah. Well, they stand to
no,
lose a lot of money if they admit that anybody else has a good point.
Yeah, exactly. They've got too much invested. Sometimes their livelihood is at stake, and I've seen them review skeptical books in such a way that it seems like that they're blind. And yet the rank and file Christian who goes online or orders these books or sees their reviews, they are bolstered in their faith. So what we have is sort of a circular. You got the more deluded people writing reviews of books that the uneducated don't know who else to trust. I mean, it's a trust factor. We can't trust atheists, you see. We can't trust skeptics. And here's a deluded person saying things, ignoring the toughest criticisms, and yet, I like what he says.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go with him because I trust him, whereas I don't trust atheists, and that's because we live in different intellectual universes.
Yeah, people like that just sounds exactly kind of like what we were talking about. People just sort of will they'll be on the hunt for evidence that goes along with what they want. So they read a review that says the atheist, book is bad, and they don't care who wrote that review. They don't care what they're associated with. All they care about is that somebody else said the atheist book is bad, and then they're going to carry on with that, and that's the part they're going to remember.
Right. They ignore the 75-star reviews of the book and then find
Right.
this single 1-star review that starts off with, well, I didn't actually read the book, but...
but I know it's bad.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's vicious. All you got to do is hopefully try to get them to read just one atheist book. I mean, and pick one. I mean, it's confirmation bias run amok. I mean, these rank and files, they won't read a book by a skeptic. I mean, not very often at all, unless they're forced to in a college class with a Christian professor who has like 3 other books required that counter it.
Right. Well, and this is also something that we talked about when we had Richard Carrier on the show, is that before someone can accept a belief, they need to get used to it being a part of the type of things that they can consider. You can't just throw something that they've never been exposed to out of left field at them and expect them to take it on, even if it's accurate. I mean, I don't know, there's this time response to the human brain that it needs some time to acclimate to new beliefs before it can accept it.
Exactly. I mean, I talk about it in terms of baby steps.
Yeah.
Right, you gotta nudge them along a little bit, and but I'm already hamstrung in a way because I'm an atheist. So anything I say, I mean, I could tell them tie your shoes before you leave the house, and they wouldn't believe me.
I'm not sure if I trust that guy. Maybe I shouldn't do that.
I don't know. That was, of course, a wildly extreme example, but it's they've got their red flags up. I know a girl who a Christian gal who wanted to read my book, didn't want to pay for it, so I gave it to her. And then she told me, well, she read it, and then she said every time I opened up the book, I would pray, "Dear Jesus, don't let me be deceived."
Right. So didn't exactly approach it with an open mind there.
Right. Well, that's not too bad of a prayer, I suppose. I don't think prayer works, but it's not too bad of a prayer, of any book you read. Why wouldn't she do that when reading one of her own Christian apologetics books?
Or the Bible.
Or the Bible.
Or like,
Jesus, don't let me be deceived.
Right.
Christians to say that. And when it comes to the Bible, it's a one-sided conversation. I mean, if somebody's listening to a phone conversation where all they hear is the person who is talking inside the room to the other person on the phone, which they can't hear, they have to fill in the gaps. What is this other person saying? In the Bible, however, all you have to do is read it and ask yourself, now let's see, people are intelligent. People didn't agree with what we read in the Bible, so let's construct their arguments. What were they saying? And, I've never seen any religious dispute like we find in the Gospels where anyone had always had the last word.
Yeah.
But in the Gospels, Jesus always has the last word. Do you think anytime he had one of these parables or I know they're reported, as such, but we have to ask ourselves, would this have been something we would expect to find that the Pharisees would walk away and discuss without having any objections? Bullshit.
Right.
Yeah.
And so all you got to do is ask what the Canaanites would have felt, how they thought. What about in Noah's day? Were they really as bad as anything? I mean, we got a bunch of, Muslims who want to do the same thing. So I don't know. It's just, that's a hobby horse of mine. Just read the Bible and ask yourself, if you were the butt end of the joke, ask yourself if you disagreed, what would you say in response?
Yeah, it'd be actually kind of a funny exercise to read through these stories about Jesus and see what, one-liners at the end you could tag on to other parties to completely change the story. Like when Jesus shows up to this wedding party or whatever, creates all the, what was it? He creates the fish and the bread?
No, you're confusing two stories.
I don't know anything about the Bible. There's some point. Shut up.
The wedding party is where he turns water into wine.
Okay, sure. So there's this wedding party where he turns water into wine. And, just imagine there's this one part that the gospel writers left off where the guy at the end says, "Oh, I thought I had brought water."
Yeah, something like that, right. Well, I brought some of that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit as well. I always like to talk about objections and responses to things like this. So you've gotten a couple of these, some of which you address in your books and others you address maybe in your blogs. I would imagine that most of these you've already heard already, but let's talk about one from David Marshall. This isn't necessarily a critique or anything, it's more just a response. He basically says that Christianity passes the outsider test for faith. A quote from him is, referring to all the people over time and across the world that have converted to Christianity, He says, "Is not this vast movement of hearts and minds over centuries and continents a more objective test of the Christian faith than the abstract mental exercise of an Indiana skeptic?"
I like David. He's a good guy. He's deluded, but he's funny. He writes well. If you read him online, he's dogging my steps lately. And I don't know why God needs him to dog my steps. Can't God make his own arguments? Can't he defend himself? I guess David feels really, really important speaking for God. But if that's the test for which faith is the correct one, then as I said in my book and you read, Mormonism is passing the test, and so is Islam by flying colors because they're growing exponentially around the world right now. You can't just rely on which religion is growing as an indicator of which faith is, passing the test. Because we already know that people accept irrational conclusions. Even smart people do. What we need to know is whether or not they've examined it as a non-believer. As a true non-believer, the kind I describe in the book that recognizes certain of the things like psychology and brain biology and anthropology. And listen, if Christianity can pass this test, I have yet to find anyone at an evangelistic meeting say, "Come to Jesus, but before you do, examine the evidence. Now, here's the Bible, and here's John Loftus's books." Until that happens, really, they become Christians due to emotional responses most of the time, growing up or in a revival meeting, or they're down in their luck or something like that, and they need some hope. Well, see, faith solves problems insofar as it provides hope. It doesn't matter if there's an object to that faith. You could believe in a flying spaghetti monster and say, he's going to help me through, life. And because of that faith, you feel help through life. What we want to know is whether or not there's an object to our faith. So, that's how I'd respond to his argument. It's just, it's really bad.
Yeah. Wait, if I could just add, it kind of sounds like, this. He says this vast movement of hearts and minds over the centuries. And when I think about the spread of Christianity over the centuries, there's also lots of swords and people saying, become a Christian or I'm going to go ahead and just kill you and your family. And I wouldn't necessarily call that a wonderful movement of hearts and minds. That's war.
Well, it's interesting because actually David Marshall brings that up to try and disqualify Islam. He says that Islam predominantly spreads via the sword rather than, a convincing argument or something.
Oh, geez, I know there was this thing called the Crusades, which was kind of a big deal. So maybe.
And there's this other thing where we came into an entire 2 continents, killed everyone who was here basically, and supplanted them with our own believers.
Right.
Yeah, we have to look at the objective evidence, and I like a book written by Philip Jenkins. It's called Jesus Wars: How 4 Patriarchs, 3 Queens, and 2 Emperors decided what Christians would believe for the next 1,500 years.
I like that. That's
right.
Really clever.
There was a massive amount of killing, and that solved the problem. Just have a little war or assassinate somebody that disagreed, and then we're going to have the belief system we want that was settled and decided after Constantine declared.
Then after that, we'll have a vast movement of hearts and minds after that.
Yeah, right. And let's look at the trend though. Let's look at the trend of these mass movement of hearts and minds. The trend has been from belief to non-belief along a trajectory that takes conservatives to, moderates to liberals. We've seen that ever since the Enlightenment. We can see it in publishing houses where, new publishing houses are started up every 10 years because the other ones have become too liberal. We see it in universities, like we see it in seminaries, Christian seminaries. New seminaries are started every 10 decades or every 10 years or so to counteract the influence of what they call liberalism. So the trend has been from conservative to liberal, to agnostic. Now, whether it hits all the way to atheism depends on the person, but that's the trend. It's not convincing people's minds and hearts. In fact, in order to sustain orthodoxy, they have to have the professors sign a faith statement. And if they sign it, then they can't go beyond the bounds of that faith statement. And if they do, they get fired. There's a lot of professors among evangelicals who are facing censure and or silencing and even firing right now.
Yeah, This happened at BYU, the Mormon college, basically. That it was called the September 7. I think it was in the early '90s that these professors were writing things that no one objected to on issues of whether or not they were true. It was like they were accurately reporting the history of the Mormon Church, and they were fired for doing this. And not because it was wrong or lying or unfairly defaming the church. It's because it was telling the story of the church didn't want people to know about.
That's not part of the approved literature. You're not allowed to talk about that.
Right. And to be doing that in a college setting is just anathema to me, to the sort of academic standards that I'm so familiar with.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
So no, if I might ask just really quickly, so David Marshall's claim that the Christianity passes the outsider test for faith, is that just that it's a vast movement of hearts and minds over the centuries, or does he have other claims as well to go along with that to support his idea that Christianity actually passes the outsider test for faith?
Oh, he has other claims to support that. I didn't deal with all of his objections on that particular page.
Okay.
But I did deal with everything he said throughout the book. But I didn't say, now, hey, everybody, this is David Marshall's argument too.
Right, of course.
Right.
So he then wrote a scathing review of my book saying I didn't deal with all of his arguments. I challenged him to name me one argument that I did not deal with in that book, and he that irritates me of him, just because I didn't say throughout the book, oh, and by the way, David Marshall, are you paying attention?
David Marshall, underline this sentence if you're still reading.
So, no, I dealt with every single one of his arguments, I think, at least sufficiently enough.
Yeah. In terms of this, I guess, saying that Christianity passes, there's another thing that I feel like I want to add, and that's the fact that there's some extent to which I really need to seriously discount the beliefs of, people from antiquity and even up to a few hundred years ago. I mean, before the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment or before widespread literacy in societies, prior to the Industrial Revolution that freed up enough time in people's days that they could think about these kinds of things. I mean, I cannot put very much stock into the opinions of people who I can't imagine would have been able to defer to something like that.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
And well said.
Yay!
With some things I don't have anything to say about.
Yeah.
Right. So one other response, we're getting kind of close to the end of the show, I'll just do one more right now, and that's that people say that the outsider test for faith unfairly targets religion. This is the outsider test of faith, not of politics or general ideas. What do you say to that sort of objection?
Well, I'm sure they feel targeted because, as I argue in the book, faith doesn't pass it. In fact, I argue that faith is an irrational leap over the probabilities. So I'm not surprised that they would say that it unfairly targets religion, but what they really mean is that it unfairly targets my religion.
Right.
Because it's obvious that, they use the test in some minimum degree when they evaluate the other faiths that they reject. So what we're trying to solve here, back to the basics, is which religion is true if there is one. And barring any other more reliable means to get believers to be consistent, then this is the only test for faith. Now, what they have to do is they have to show that the outsider test for faith is unbiased or unfair, and then after that provide a better alternative. And as I argue, in the book that they have not done so because they already know what it's like to be a non-believer. So to say it's unfairly targeting religion is just simply say, well, I think you're just unfairly targeting me. And then when it comes to morals and politics and other kinds of areas, that's quite a long discussion, if we were to go into it here. But let's say we did apply it to morality. Well, how should we evaluate those things? I've seen Thomas Talbot, a Christian philosopher, he would say, and along with Victor Reppert, that, that if we applied it to our views on rape, that therefore we couldn't say rape was wrong. I blister that in my book. I think at least half the population, women, would agree that rape is wrong. You see, and I don't see anyone who would ever say, in public anyway, that rape should be morally justified because they have mothers and they have daughters and they have sisters, and don't neglect the fact that some males are raped as well. So
certainly not.
We have to evaluate the evidence and come up with a good social contract where we're all safe. And I think that the anti-rape ethic more than passes the outsider's test for faith. But let's just say that if you apply the outsider's test for faith to morality, then it leads to cultural relativism, the boogeyman, the bad guy,
Right.
And I say, well, fine, bite the bullet. You can't reject the evidence for a conclusion if that obtains based on the fact that you don't like the conclusion. And just learn what cultural relativism is and learn to embrace it, is what I argue.
I think I agree with you that a lot of people who don't like this claim that it's unfairly targeting religion are really what they're saying is it's unfairly targeting their own beliefs. And
it makes me feel uncomfortable.
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny because you're right that people do apply the outsider test of faith to other beliefs. And so what actually happens here, if you sort of think about this for a second, is what they're doing is they're unfairly not targeting their own beliefs with this same test.
Yeah.
I wish I had put that in my book.
Well, you'll need to hire me as an editor the next time.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up what we've been wanting to talk about. Do either of you have anything else you wanted to add before we sort of end the show?
Well, I guess the other part of the chapter that I enjoyed was when you talk about how smart people, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but smart people can believe in wacky things with just like one or two false premises.
Right.
Because I know a lot of smart people who are very, very religious, and sometimes I wonder, like, how can that be? Almost, I guess that's kind of a rude way of putting it, but would you mind, I mean, sure, you can explain that bit more eloquently than I can. Could you go into that just briefly about how, you just need one or two false premises and then you can believe in anything, even if you are an intelligent person?
Well, I don't know. I suppose you could look at conspiracy theorists. They think that there must be more important people or divinities behind momentous historical changing events. And, due to that, they look at the evidence and they twist it to fit that presupposition. Or, as Valerie Tarico writes so eloquently, she said, you can sit with a psychiatric manual next to you and listen to a paranoid schizophrenic who says the CIA is dogging their steps. And you can think, even though you have a degree like she does, and even though you have the manual next to her, she said, and doggone it, maybe the CIA really is bugging this guy. And so, I mean, all you need to do is have a few false presuppositions and you can twist the evidence in your favor. And it's the problem. It's the problem that we all need to look at, and we need to basically reevaluate those presuppositions. And when it comes to religious faiths, since they are learned on mama's knee, so to speak, and since people who have learned a different religion on a different mama's knee, therefore they ought to be, skeptical that their mama taught them right.
Right. We should be skeptical of beliefs that come from our mama's knees.
That's exactly what I was going to say, but I'm glad I let you say it.
There's nothing really wrong with that, even though we love our mothers implicitly. But if they told us Santa existed, then we believed until they told us otherwise. They probably told us things like, well, there's a country named China too, so we accepted that implicitly without ever having traveled there. And there's a map that she points out, and so we'd accept that as well.
Right. I mean, there's two sides of this. Both of these arguments from mama's knees are a logical fallacy. You can't say it came from mama's knee, so it's true, or that it's false.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And
well, anyway,
I argue that when we grow up, we need to examine, as adults, the beliefs that our mom taught us through the lens of sufficient evidence, especially since there is so much widespread disagreement on some of them. And religion, of course, being the most disagreed upon idea we were taught to believe, then we ought to examine that one. And we ought to do so as adults. And as adults, we should be skeptical. I mean, just as everyone else is of every other religion.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed that part of the book that I mentioned earlier about, like what you were talking about with the guy who thinks the CIA is following him and twisting evidence in your favor and stuff like that. That was sort of refreshing for me to read that part because I felt, it kind of, I just felt like it was especially relevant for me and like sort of my life. So thanks for that. It was good. It was really good.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. What I write helps people, and I like knowing that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and thank you so much for coming on the show with us. This has been such a pleasure getting to speak with you. I've really enjoyed your writing so far, and I look forward to stuff that you produce in the future.
Well, actually, I'll just say something. This will be the first time it's announced. I don't know when your program will air, but I'm working on a new book, another anthology called Christianity is Not Great, titled after Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. I've got some confirmed authors, including Michael Shermer, Russell Blackford, and Valerie Tirico, Richard Carrier, David Eller. Others I'm probably neglecting, and I'm sorry about that. I'll be proposing probably in the next week or so, and hopefully it'll go. There's no guarantees,
right.
But I'm pretty excited about the proposal. I think that with the authors lined up, including Victor Stenger and Peter Boghossian, I think that it'll go. And what we're doing in that book is we're talking about the harms of faith. Harriet Hall is going to write one on faith healing. We've got a couple chapters on the harms of faith itself. We deal with the witch hunts, slavery, race relations, gay and lesbian diversity, the environment, and I'm this is off the tip of my head right now. But so this will be the first time it's announced that I'm proposing it, not that it's been accepted for a proposal.
Right.
If it doesn't go, it doesn't go. But I think with the authors lined up, it's a good book, and I think it will probably go. But it'll probably be off into the future, probably a year and a half before it actually sees print.
Well, that's really great. I've always enjoyed your anthologies in the past, and I know they've pretty widely received really, really good reception. So I'm really excited to hear more about that in the future.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm excited that you announced it on our show.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, you get to be the first.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, well, hey, everyone, go ahead and check out John Loftus's blog, Debunking Christianity, and what was the other one?
Well, skepticinc.net, yeah. It's a blog network with 24 different writers from different perspectives from around the world, and it's a really cool blog network.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you once again, John Loftus, for coming on the show. It's been such a pleasure getting to speak with you, and I've really enjoyed this time. Thanks again.
Me as
All
well.
right, thank you so much. Yep.
All right, see ya.
So yeah, that'll be it. I will send you a link to the episode. You can feel free to spread it around if you want, but if you don't want to, we won't care at all.
I will spread it around, of course.
All right.
Especially come out looking good.
All right, great.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'll re-splice your words so you sound like a violent sociopath. All right, well, thank you once again for listening to NonTheology. It's been a pleasure getting to speak with Mr. John Loftus.
It really was a pleasure. I really, really enjoyed it. He's a very intelligent and very funny sort of guy, and wrote a great book, which I, had to relearn how to read just to read it because I had forgotten how to read. It's been so long. But
yeah, Eric had been a little bit pissy after our episode with Gary Marcus because he hadn't read the book. And
no, I wasn't pissy. I just didn't have anything to contribute.
And so this time, in order to get Eric some of the reading material, I had to buy him the book.
He mailed it to me. The book showed up at my doorstep. It's like, oh, I know what this is. Gabe sent me this book. Then I won't pay him back for it. I'm sure that'll never happen.
I wasn't expecting you to.
Next, if I ever get around to visiting you, I'll buy you a drink. Call it even.
You'll probably get me a tap water or something from my own sink.
Anyway, it was a great interview. I thought it was fantastic.
I also thought it was fantastic. Hopefully our listeners did as well, and hopefully they're happy that we are back on the air and recording.
Not dead.
All right. Eric, send us off.
You always ask me to do that, and I don't know what to say. What do you want? Like, I'm not a news anchor. I don't have a sign-off saying.
Well, you should develop one.
You've been listening to NonTheology, and shut up, Gabe.